All right, so today we're going to really dive deep into something that I think a lot of people have been wondering about, and especially people who, love to be out on the water. Maybe you're a weekend sailor, or you run a bigger, maritime operation. And that is, of course, Starlink at sea.
Yeah.
How to make it work,
Yeah, for sure.
We've been looking at a lot of information from rain data solutions, and I think we've got a pretty good handle now on how this can really be a reliable way to get high-speed internet, even when you're miles from shore.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's something that's definitely shifted from, kind of a luxury to something more essential now for, I think, anybody who's spending time offshore, whether it's for navigation safety or just keeping everybody, happy with entertainment.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, you don't want to be out there and, suddenly can't get the weather update that you need or there's some kind of emergency.
Right.
So yeah, Starlink, I mean, it's really kind of promising.
Yeah.
A whole new world, I think, for people who are out on the water. Where do we even begin? I guess, what's the first thing that people need to really understand when they're thinking about Starlink at sea?
Well, I think the first, and I think the most crucial thing is having a clear view of the sky, which kind of makes sense, right? It's a satellite system.
Yeah.
But, what's interesting is that it's not just about, pointing it up and hoping for the best, the Starlink system. Actually, it has the ability to detect obstructions and even build a map in its interface to show you potential, signal blockers and things like that.
Oh, wow.
So it's really trying to optimize the connection for you.
That's amazing. I mean, so it's not just about generally pointing the dish in the right direction. Mm-hmm. It's actually analyzing its surroundings and giving you this visual representation of where there might be problems.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that takes a lot of the guesswork out, I would imagine.
Yeah. And there is a little bit of a caveat there. The information does say that it can take up to 12 hours for that analysis to fully complete. Yeah. After the initial installation. So you do have to have a little patience with it while it learns its environment. But the point is, really picking a spot where there are as few obstacles as possible, and then regularly checking that obstruction map is really, your first line of defense in getting a good, solid connection.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so you scattered out your spot, you've got a nice clear view of the sky, you've mounted your dish nice and securely.
Yep.
How do you then actually get that Starlink internet into, the rest of your boat's systems? You've got Wi-Fi on board, you've got all your devices. How does that all work?
Okay, so that's where integrating it with your onboard Wi-Fi network comes in. And basically, you need an Ethernet connection running from the Starlink tower supply straight into your router to the WAN port.
Okay.
And that's really the physical link between the two systems.
So it's almost like plugging in a new cable modem at home.
It is very similar, yeah.
But there's probably a little bit more to it than that,
yeah.
Right? In terms of setting things up.
Yeah, there are a couple of configurations on the router side of things that you need to be aware of. And one of the key ones is setting the WAN port to DHCP.
Okay.
And DHCP, it basically automatically assigns an address, so your router and the Starlink system can communicate without you having to manually put in, a bunch of numbers.
Right.
It just simplifies things.
So a lot of it is happening automatically behind the scenes then, which is good for those of us who aren't, networking experts.
Exactly.
Now, there was something in here about health checks.
Right.
What is that all about?
Yeah. So think of health checks as your router's way of kind of constantly checking on the connection.
Oh, okay.
To make sure it's still there and out at sea. You might have brief little interruptions. Maybe a wave gets in the way momentarily or something.
Right.
So, by setting up failure thresholds, they actually give an example in the information. They say 5 failed pings in 10 seconds.
Okay.
That gives your router a little bit of, leeway to not immediately think that the connection is gone when it's just, a very brief blip. So it builds in a little tolerance for those hiccups.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're not constantly, getting dropped offline and having to reconnect. It's just a much smoother experience.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Now, the other thing, of course, is we're talking about being out on the water.
Yeah.
The elements, salt spray, all of that.
Yeah.
How well is the actual Starlink equipment built to withstand that kind of environment?
Well, that's where those IP ratings come in, which are really helpful. And the source actually gives us those for the main components. So the Starlink dish itself and the power supply both have an IP56 rating,
okay,
which means they're well protected against dust, and they can handle being sprayed directly with water. Think about like a powerful jet of water.
Wow.
Which you might expect on a boat, so that's pretty robust.
Yeah, it sounds like they're built to take a bit of a beating.
They are, yeah. The Wi-Fi router that's included has a slightly lower rating. It's IP54. So it's still dust resistant, but the water protection is really more for splashing rather than direct, strong jets of water.
Right.
So you probably want to keep that in a more protected location, inside the vessel.
Makes sense. Yeah. You don't want a rogue wave taking out your router.
Right.
Let's talk about cables now, because, cables are the unsung heroes of any internet connection.
Yeah.
But especially in a marine environment, they take a lot of abuse.
They do.
What should people be thinking about in terms of keeping those connections solid and well maintained?
Well, they really emphasize the importance of using a non-setting sealant, like dielectric grease, on any cable connections that are exposed to water.
Okay.
That's really going to help prevent corrosion and just keep moisture out of those connections.
Dielectric grease. I mean, sounds kind of simple, but I guess it's very effective.
It is, yeah. And, they do have a specific warning about not using RTV sealant on the actual seal or the mating surfaces of the connector. But there is a specific use for Dow 737 RTV. They do recommend using that on the outside edge where the socket and plug meet after it's connected.
Okay.
And that basically provides a little extra layer of waterproofing.
So dielectric grease on the inside, Dow 737 RTV on the outside. And I imagine, just basic cable management is also important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You want to make sure you're preventing chafing, you're keeping them away from sharp edges anywhere they might get stepped on. Just good cable management will go a long way.
For sure. Now, the cables themselves, are these just, standard Ethernet cables that you could buy anywhere, or are they a bit more specialized?
They are a bit more specialized, and they do have some limitations. First of all, they're not reversible.
Okay.
Each end is designed to go into a specific piece of equipment.
Oh, interesting.
So you can't mix them up.
That's a good design feature.
Yeah. And then there are some length restrictions. You might find that the ideal spot for your dish is a bit further away from your power supply.
Yeah.
So there's a maximum distance of 25 meters between the dish and the power supply unit.
Okay.
And that's due to the power requirements of the dish. So they really don't want you extending or splicing that cable.
Right.
You need to work within that 25-meter limit.
Okay. 25 meters between dish and power supply.
Yeah.
That's important to know when you're planning your setup.
Yeah.
But what about the total run from the dish all the way to like your network equipment?
Yeah.
Inside the boat.
So the total allowable length for that whole run is 100 meters.
Okay.
So you have a bit more flexibility once you're past the power supply, but they give all the specifics of the cable. It's a Category 5E cable. It's designed for indoor and outdoor use. It's sunlight resistant. It has all these, flame ratings and temperature ratings.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not just your average cable.
Right. It's engineered specifically for this kind of application.
Right.
Now, let's say you've got a bigger vessel, or maybe you're running some kind of operation where you just need more bandwidth than one Starlink can provide. Yeah. What about using multiple dishes? What are the things people need to consider there?
Yeah, that's where you can really start to boost your bandwidth. You can use multiple Starlink units, but there are some guidelines you have to follow. And the one they mentioned is there's a minimum separation distance of 0.9 meters between the dishes. So just under a yard to prevent interference. And obviously each dish still needs that clear, unobstructed view of the sky.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're picturing like, a multi-dish setup on a larger boat, you've got to think about that spacing and make sure each one has that clear line of sight.
Exactly.
Now, the other thing is, okay, you've got all these Starlink connections coming in. How do you actually manage that increased bandwidth to make sure it's being used effectively?
Right. So that's where you're probably going to need a third-party router, something a bit more sophisticated than what comes with the Starlink system. And they actually mention the Marine Data Solutions MDS Blender as an example. And these are routers that are designed to handle multiple internet connections. And they can do things like load balancing. So they distribute the traffic across all the available connections. They can do failover. So if one connection drops, the other one picks up seamlessly.
Right.
And they have, all sorts of traffic management tools. So you can prioritize different types of data. So it's a way to really harness that power of multiple Starlink units.
It makes sense. You need something to kind of orchestrate the whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And once you've got everything all set up and running smoothly, what kind of ongoing maintenance are we talking about, to keep Starlink working well in a marine environment?
The good news is the hardware itself is really designed to be pretty low maintenance.
Yeah.
But a few things, it's a good idea to keep the antenna free from any, big buildup of salt or dust that can interfere with the signal.
Okay.
The Starlink app or the web interface will let you monitor the percentage of obstructions over time so you can see if there are any new issues popping up. And if you're in a colder climate, you can enable the snow melting feature
Cool, right. Yeah, of course.
to prevent buildup on the dish. So it's more about proactive care than, constant maintenance.
All right, that makes sense. Now, of course, inevitably, sometimes things go wrong.
Yeah.
Even with the best setup, what are some good initial troubleshooting steps that people can take if they're out at sea and suddenly their Starlink is not cooperating?
They give a really good step-by-step approach to this. And the first thing always is check the local weather conditions.
Yeah.
Heavy rain or cloud cover can impact the signal.
Right.
Then do a visual inspection of all your cable connections. Make sure everything's plugged in securely, from the dish to the power supply to the router.
Okay.
Check the power supply unit. Make sure the indicator light is on. It's a basic one, but it's important.
Right, yeah.
And then if you are using a third-party router, try bypassing it temporarily. Just connect a laptop directly to the Starlink power supply with an Ethernet cable. And that way you can isolate whether the problem is with the Starlink connection itself or with your onboard network.
Yeah, that's a good tip. And then, of course, the Starlink dashboard, which you can get through the app or through a web browser.
Right.
That gives you, system status information.
Yeah, so you can see if there are any known outages or issues.
Right, so it's always a good idea to check that too.
Exactly.
Okay, so just to kind of sum up our deep dive here, we're talking about Starlink at sea based on all this information from Marine Data Solutions.
Yeah.
It seems like the key takeaways are that clear view of the sky is absolutely essential.
Yes.
You've got to have the right Ethernet connections and router setup to integrate with your existing systems.
Right.
Paying attention to the specifics of the cables and how you handle them is crucial. And then a little bit of, regular monitoring and knowing some basic troubleshooting steps will really go a long way.
It will, yeah. And I think, what we're seeing is that Starlink really is a game changer for internet access out on the water. But like any technology, taking the time to set it up correctly and paying attention to the details that we talked about, it's really going to unlock the full potential of it.
For sure. And it just makes me think, we're so reliant on being connected these days, even when we're out in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
It's just incredible to think about, how these advancements in maritime connectivity are going to continue to change, not just how we operate on the water, but how we actually experience our time out there.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point.
Yeah. So that's something to ponder for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.